Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. If you're not watching Tiger King, you probably should. It's hilarious and crazy and good for the brain in these times. All right, so we're going to do the Cold War, on the post policies following 1945. They're going to set up the global economy. So that's where we're going to go. Here we are. So technically, we still live in the post Cold War world. And a lot of the foreign policy decisions that we make or made previous to this administration revolved around the relationships and the established economic and war partnerships that were forged. NATO, namely the North American Treaty Organization, and we'll talk more about that, are all centered around the Cold War. So the enemy now is obviously not the communists, but it is, this global terrorism. And so the approach that we use and the organizations that we established back in the Cold War still exist, and we use them for this new war front. Okay, how do I get the slide to advance? Oh, that's not working. Okay, there we go. All right. So when you simplify what the Cold War is, it's the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union for world dominance. Now, it's important to know that after World War II, despite the fact that it was a war fought for really just reasons, the United States had more people living under the American flag outside the borders of the United States than they did within the borders, right? So it does become a war of empire, and the United States is the winner of that. Now, we knew when we negotiated, when Roosevelt and Churchill negotiated with Stalin, and they were determining, what was to come. They knew that Stalin was going to take political control of the countries in Eastern Europe. The countries that he liberated from Nazi control were going to be under his auspices. So we knew that, and we just figured that that was something we were going to have to deal with later in order to defeat this common enemy. And so that's what happened. So now the United States traditionally had an active communist party. Even now, about 11% of the population is a member of the Communist Party, and actually it may be higher. Given the 2008 economic crisis. I haven't really looked up the numbers recently. So then that tends to happen in times of economic struggle. But with the coming of the Cold War, there's a need to completely demonize the Soviet Union and their mentality. So, they used to call him Uncle Joe, and now he is our mortal enemy, right? So if you want to know why boomers are so anti-socialism, anti-communism, is because they were raised to be terrified of the communist threat. And so they're completely irrational when it comes to understanding modern economics and policy, because their view is poisoned by this constant fear of Soviet invasion and takeover, right? Okay. So enough about trash and boomers. Okay. So, we, as you know now, globally, we are all interconnected. In some ways that's great. In other ways that's not great. So we have these economic and military alliances in place to help us. And a lot of the choices that we made at the end of World War II only empowered the United States. And to see a lot of that coming apart under the current administration is really frustrating, not just on a political level, but on a global political scale and a global economic scale. We are withdrawing from institutions and organizations that we typically ran from the inside. We are leaving a power vacuum across the globe, and Russia and China are more than happy to take up our efforts and replace us. So that's really problematic. So, what most people don't realize is the decisions that the government makes, like sending foreign aid money to small countries and things like that, that's to avoid warfare from happening. It's actually saving us money in the long run and saving us troops because of the instability in a lot of those regions. So they're necessary. They're not popular. and I myself think it's really interesting that we would support, the healthcare system for Israel, but then we can't support one for our own country. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, so we've basically always been at odds with the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, and we always probably will be. Russia is not our friend. And even today in the Syrian war, which it's kind of hard to even think about that because we are in the middle of our own global crisis with the coronavirus. But in Syria, we're in war in Syria, which started out as a civil war. The people in Syria were under a drought. They didn't have enough food and water. People from the country were moving to the cities. There was tension. There's not enough supplies to go around. You can kind of see how that goes now. And so some teenagers were caught vandalizing and protesting, and they shot teenagers. The army shot teenagers. And so that's how the Civil War started. Now, the United States has backed the rebels, and the Soviet Union has backed the Assad regime, the president, the quote-unquote legitimate power of the country. And we have been fighting opposing sides. Now, when Trump is issuing airstrikes into Syria, what he does is calls Russia first and tells them, hey, we're launching a missile because we don't want to accidentally hit the Russians, okay? And then Russia calls Assad and they clear the site of people. So any strikes that we're doing are really sort of worthless because we're not killing people. We're just, we're doing a show of power, but we're not actually making any changes. And that's really frustrating. I've heard from people I know that have been over there that the Russian planes are buzzing American planes all the time. They're trying to get us to fire on them. They're trying to get us to start, I guess what would be World War III. I don't know. So, it's what we might consider, a proxy war, sort of like Vietnam. Like we're fighting in Syria, but we're not really, it's not the Syrians that we're fighting for. And actually, they're fighting over access to a natural gas pipeline. If the Russians win, they get it. And if we win, we get it. But Trump's been withdrawing, and I don't know what's going to happen with that because it's not even in the news anymore because it's just not even what anybody is thinking about. All right. So we're really worried about the economy, right? So we know what happens when the economy globally is unstable. We get Hitler, we get authoritarian leaders. So in order to prevent that from happening, and our real fear was that they'd all turn communist. So we established money, basically. We gave money to help Europe rebuild so that they wouldn't need to turn to the Soviets and, the whole of Europe become communist. So we create the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan, which we'll talk about in a little bit, so that these things pump money into the European economy. So we give money to Germany, right? And then Germany pays reparations to England and France. And then England and France pays us, our loans back. So it's kind of like we're just paying ourselves, right? Well, no, because when that money flows through the economy and pays people's wages and buys goods, it's the spending of money that makes an economy work, right? That's why all these stimulus plans right now that they're working on in Congress, they just passed Stimulus 3, they're trying to pass Stimulus 4. And Bernie Sanders is pushing for $2,000 a month for every American family. Why is that? Because the economy is suffering. And it doesn't matter how much money you pump into Wall Street. That's not what's going to save the economy. What saves the economy is that people are spending money. Wealthy people just put money in the bank. Poor people, which is most of us, even if you're, middle class, you're still not ever going to be, one of the top 1% of the country. So you spending money, buying on Amazon and ordering music and whatever it is you're doing is what's going to help the economy recover. And that's why it's so important. And that's basically what they're doing here. So you're kind of living through that experience. Luckily, nothing's been bombed and all our buildings are in place and we still have electricity. But the concept is the same. You've got to pump money into the economy to make the economy work. Okay, so The United Nations. If you remember back in World War One, we created the League of Nations, but then the Congress was isolationist and didn't want to join. So we know that we have to be a part of the United Nations this time. And the idea is that we have a forum to solve our problems, to work out our differences without resorting to war. And for the most part, it's been pretty successful. There's a huge part of the UN, which is dealing with refugees and human rights, and that's in response to the Holocaust. A lot of that was because of Eleanor Roosevelt. She helped develop the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is the guaranteed rights that we all have as citizens on this planet, including the right to an education, right to religious freedom, indigenous rights, etc., etc. So that is probably one of the biggest things to come out that isn't economically based. So the Nuremberg trials were where we tried the Nazi leaders. Not that many got tried. And what ended up happening is that a lot of the people were using Hitler as a scapegoat because he's dead, right? So who cares? So they're like, oh, I did it because I was ordered to. I was ordered to. Well, that's no longer a valid response. You are not allowed to carry out human rights violations, even if you're ordered to. I was told to do it is no longer a valid response. And that's called the Nuremberg Principle. And that's pretty important. Okay. I've got like 3 minutes here. So we want to rebuild Germany's economy for the reason that all of our economies are connected and we know what happens. And that's not what the Soviets wanted to do. So we end up splitting Germany into two parts. So every country, every allied victor had a zone. There's the American zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. And then we all joined together, all the non-communist nations, and that became West Germany, and then East Germany was the Soviet piece. All right. So we know my favorite guy, Churchill. This is where that term, the Iron Curtain, comes in, and he says in a speech in Missouri at a college commencement, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe. And so that was that term. He loved naming stuff, and that one stuck too. So he's warning us, and he knew more than anybody what the plans of the Soviets were. And of course, everyone, the minute that the war was over, Churchill was booted out of office. They put Attlee in charge. He was the prime minister. And Churchill's like, but wait, there's more. And everyone's like, oh, shut up, Churchill. You're just a warmonger. Yeah, and we see how that goes. Everybody should listen to Churchill. He knows what he's talking about. All right, I'm going to stop here, go get a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever, and I'll set up for the next video. It's a continuation.